The air over the Solomon Islands on July 5, 1943, felt like a living thing, heavy, wet, and trembling with the sound of engines that had not yet appeared through the clouds, as though the very sky knew something monstrous was about to reveal itself. Dawn crept over the Pacific in slow, gray bands of light, cutting through the mist and painting the waves below in shades of silver and blue. High above, Japanese reconnaissance pilots, hardened veterans of the air war, scanned the horizon from the cramped cockpits of their Zeros. They had flown this route 100 times before, circling the Russell Islands searching for any sign of the enemy. The war had become routine for them, a deadly rhythm of takeoff, patrol, and interception. To these men, confident and relentless, the sky still belonged to the Empire of Japan. And then, just after 7 in the morning, one of them saw something strange glinting through the haze. At first it was a shimmer, barely visible against the ocean's endless surface. But as it rose higher, the shape took form, a flight of American fighters, climbing sluggishly through the cloud layer, their wings curved downward like the bent limbs of a wounded bird. The Japanese pilot tilted his head, squinting through the reflection of his canopy glass. These planes looked absurd, fat-bellied, broad-winged, with noses so long they seemed to drag the rest of the fuselage behind them. He laughed, keying his radio to his comrades. "New American plane," he said, amusement clear in his voice. "Like a whale with wings." Another pilot chuckled. "Good, easier targets." It was the arrogance of experience speaking. Men who had outflown Wildcats and Hellcats, who had seen American fighters burn and crash into the sea. The Zero was still king of the Pacific skies, and nothing the enemy built could challenge that supremacy. Or so they believed. As the Japanese patrol closed in, the sun lifted higher, and for a moment the two squadrons floated in the same breath of air, one laughing, one silent. The Americans flew tight and low, their dark blue Corsairs shimmering faintly in the morning light. The Japanese could almost taste victory already. They began their descent. The first Zero peeled away from formation, diving like a blade through the air, its machine guns armed, its pilot grinning beneath his mask. He would be the first to strike, the first to remind the enemy who ruled these skies. But then something unexpected happened. The lead American plane, a bulky F4U Corsair, suddenly rolled onto its back and dove straight at him. It moved with an impossible grace, banking sharply and twisting into a vertical climb that no one thought such a heavy aircraft could manage. The Japanese pilot's grin faltered as tracer rounds flashed past his canopy. He jerked the stick hard right, but it was too late. The Corsair's 6.50 caliber guns tore through his fuselage in a hail of thunder and flame. The Zero exploded into shards of light, disappearing into the clouds below. The Japanese formation erupted into chaos. Voices crackled over the radio, shouting in disbelief. "They can climb," one screamed. "They can die faster than us!" The laughter was gone. What followed was not a dogfight, it was an execution carried out with mechanical precision. The Corsairs moved like predators, using speed and altitude to control the battle. Their massive engines, Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasps, roared so loudly that pilots on the ground claimed they could feel it through the soles of their boots. In those engines lived over 2,000 horsepower, and for the first time in the Pacific, American pilots had something that could not just match the Zero, but destroy it. Lieutenant Ken Walsh, a Marine Corps aviator, led part of the formation that day. He had once flown the clumsy Wildcats that Japanese pilots mocked, but now, strapped into his new Corsair, he felt an entirely different kind of power beneath his hands. "Let's see if they still laugh," he muttered before pulling his aircraft into a steep climb. Below him, a Zero tried to follow. It stalled halfway up, its propeller coughing smoke as it dropped back down toward the ocean. Walsh inverted his plane and came down like a hammer, his guns lighting up the sky. Another kill, another plume of fire curling into the sea. Within minutes, the balance shifted entirely. The Corsairs sliced through the formation, diving from the clouds, striking, then vanishing before the Japanese could react. The gull-wing design that had seemed so ungainly a moment ago now made sense. It allowed the Corsair's enormous propeller to clear the ground while giving its wings the perfect angle for lift and speed. It wasn't a mistake of design, it was genius hidden in plain sight. One by one, Japanese fighters went down, the sky filled with trails of smoke, spinning metal, and the desperate voices of men realizing they had misjudged their enemy. "They disappear into the sun," one cried. "I cannot see them. Where are they?" But the Corsairs weren't disappearing. They were diving faster than the human eye could follow, breaking away only to climb again with monstrous energy. In less than 20 minutes, 12 Japanese aircraft had vanished from the radar. Not a single parachute opened. To the men watching from the deck of the Japanese carrier Junyo, it looked as though the heavens themselves had turned against them. Silence fell over the radio. The pilots who survived that encounter would never forget the image of those blue-winged machines streaking through the clouds, engines howling like living things. The laughter that had filled their cockpits minutes earlier was gone, swallowed by the roar of the Corsairs' guns. Later that day, one Japanese officer, staring at the empty sea where his comrades had fallen, muttered a quiet confession to no one in particular. "We thought them clumsy, but they were waiting for us." The Corsair had arrived, not with ceremony or announcement, but with sudden violent proof. It was a symbol of American adaptation, a weapon born out of desperation after years of being outflown and outgunned. Its pilots had learned from defeat, from watching friends burn over the Coral Sea in Midway. The Corsair was their answer, forged from everything they had suffered and everything they still refused to lose, and on that morning it rewrote the rules of air combat in the Pacific. The Japanese would never again approach American fighters with laughter in their voices. The ocean below, littered with wreckage, reflected the price of arrogance. As the surviving Corsairs turned for home, their engines fading into the distance, the clouds closed behind them, sealing the story of 12 vanished planes in mist and silence. History would remember that day not as a skirmish but as a warning, a reminder that in war, appearances deceive, and every weapon mocked today might be the nightmare of tomorrow. Imagine being one of those Japanese pilots, laughing into your radio as you dove toward what you thought were helpless enemies, only to watch your squadron vanish one by one into the burning sky. Would you have seen it coming? By mid-1943, the Pacific War had become a contest of endurance, a brutal chess match fought over coral atolls, jungle-covered ridges, and the boundless blue between them. The Japanese Empire still held vast swaths of the Pacific, but the tide was beginning to turn. After the catastrophic losses at Midway and the slow bleed of Guadalcanal, Japan's pilots were no longer the untouchable masters of the air they had once been. The Imperial Navy's air groups had been forged in the fire of early victories, but now many of those veterans lay buried beneath the ocean. In their place came younger, less experienced aviators, still brave, still fierce, but not yet hardened by the same crucible. Meanwhile, the Americans had been learning, painfully, relentlessly. Every defeat had been studied, every mistake dissected. Engineers and pilots alike were searching for something that could finally wrest air superiority from Japan's deadly Zero. The Zero had defined the early Pacific War. It was fast, agile, and unforgiving, a machine that seemed to defy physics itself. Its light frame allowed it to outturn nearly anything that tried to chase it. At the beginning of the conflict, no Allied aircraft could hope to match it in a dogfight. Japanese pilots had grown accustomed to that dominance. They expected it. It became part of their identity as warriors. But technological supremacy in war is fragile. It lasts only until the enemy learns how to break it. For the Americans, that turning point began in laboratories and factories, not in the skies. Even before Pearl Harbor, Vought engineers had been designing a new carrier-based fighter for the Navy, a machine that would push the limits of piston engine power. They envisioned a plane so fast, so heavily armed that it could outfight anything on Earth. The prototype, designated XF4U-1, made its first flight in 1940 and immediately broke speed records. It was the first single-engine fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight, but speed came at a cost. The Corsair was temperamental, even dangerous. Its enormous propeller demanded long landing gear that folded awkwardly under stress. The cockpit sat so far back that pilots could barely see the runway on approach. Early test pilots called it a widowmaker. The Navy wasn't impressed and initially refused to bring it aboard carriers. For a time, the Corsair seemed destined to be forgotten, a technological marvel with no place in combat. But then came 1942. The Japanese were advancing across the Pacific like wildfire, and the American arsenal was straining to keep pace. The Marines, desperate for something with teeth, decided to take a chance. If the Navy didn't want the Corsair, they would make it their own. Marine pilots began testing it on rough island airstrips, adapting its quirks into strengths. They learned to land it differently, to respect its power rather than fear it. Slowly, they unlocked what the engineers had built into its frame, a fighter that could climb faster, dive harder, and strike deadlier than anything the Japanese could field. Still, the war in the air was about more than machinery. It was a contest of cultures, of philosophies. Japanese air doctrine prized agility and precision, a pilot's instinct sharpened by years of discipline. The Americans, on the other hand, began to rely on brute strength, teamwork, and evolving technology. The Corsair embodied that shift. It wasn't a gentleman's dueling aircraft like the Zero. It was a brawler, a gun platform designed to destroy rather than dance. With 6 heavy Browning machine guns, armor plating, and self-sealing fuel tanks, it could take hits and keep flying. It didn't need to turn tighter than its enemy. It just had to hit harder and survive longer. By early 1943, the Solomons became the stage for this new philosophy of warfare. Guadalcanal had been secured, but barely. The Japanese still launched nightly raids from nearby bases, harassing Marines and ships alike. Every day, the skies above the islands turned into dueling grounds between exhausted men and machines pushed beyond their limits. The Americans needed a new edge, and they were about to get one. The first Corsairs arrived in the Pacific in early spring, untested in true combat. Their pilots were nervous, skeptical. Some still believed the stories of uncontrollable dives and deadly landing stalls, but those who flew it learned quickly that once airborne, it was unlike anything they had ever touched. The engine's growl became a kind of reassurance, a deep, thunderous heartbeat that seemed to say, "You are no longer prey." The Marines stationed at Henderson Field and Munda Point began to experiment, flying mock engagements against older aircraft to test their limits. Word spread fast. The bent-wing bird can outclimb the Zero. Meanwhile, the Japanese were growing desperate to reclaim the skies over the Solomons. They couldn't allow the Americans to gain another foothold. For them, this theater wasn't just about territory, it was about pride. Losing control of the air meant losing the war of perception, and the Zero's mythical reputation had to be preserved at all costs. Yet the Empire's industrial machine was faltering, and its pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Each engagement chipped away at their strength, each lost ace a blow to morale. Still, they believed in their superiority. When word reached Japanese Air Command that American forces were fielding a new fighter, the reaction was dismissive. "Another heavy clunker," one officer reportedly sneered. "They will learn the same lesson." And so, as July approached, patrols were ordered to engage any sightings of the new aircraft, to test it, to prove that the Zero still ruled the Pacific. The Americans, for their part, didn't yet know they were about to make history. To them, the July 5th mission was routine. Another escort flight over the islands, another day of surviving the oppressive heat, the blinding glare of the sea, and the endless threat of death. They had no idea that within hours their ungainly, often criticized aircraft would redefine air combat. The stage was set, the sky, the ocean, the men, and their machines. The Corsair had been born from failure and doubt, the Zero from victory and pride. Both would meet over the Solomons in a battle that would last mere minutes but echo through decades of aviation history. Far below, the jungles of the islands rustled with unseen life, indifferent to the steel and fire that was about to tear through the sky above them. The Americans believed they were flying a test. The Japanese believed they were hunting an easy kill. Neither side yet understood what would happen when arrogance met innovation in the clouds over the Pacific. Variant 52721. Variant Standard Title Section 2 Background and Context. Single paragraph 1,000 plus words. Ebri. By the summer of 1943, the Pacific had become a graveyard of ambition, a vast expanse of blue water littered with the wreckage of dreams and the twisted remains of aircraft that once symbolized the pride of nations, and in that great empty theater the tides of war were shifting in ways neither side fully understood. Japan had carved its empire across the ocean with brutal speed, its pilots and planes dominating every early engagement from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. But 2 years of relentless combat had begun to take their toll. The Imperial Navy's air wings, once filled with elite veterans who seemed invincible in their nimble Mitsubishi Zeros, were being whittled down by attrition. The Zero, for all its brilliance, was built on a dangerous philosophy: speed and agility purchased at the expense of protection. It had no armor to speak of, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and in the early days of the war, it didn't need them. The Zero's grace was its armor, its maneuverability its shield, and its pilots were trained to trust in skill rather than steel. But skill was finite, and death was catching up. By 1943, many of Japan's best aviators were gone, replaced by younger, less experienced men whose training had been shortened by desperation. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the Americans were learning, painfully, brutally, and fast. Every defeat, every burned-out fuselage on the beaches of Guadalcanal, every shattered bomber that failed to return from Rabaul was a lesson written in blood. Engineers, tacticians, and pilots studied their losses with obsession. They knew the Zero could not be beaten in a turning fight, so they sought a different kind of fighter, one that didn't need to turn tighter, one that could simply overpower its enemy through speed, climb, and firepower. The answer came from Chance Vought, a company that dared to design a plane so radical it looked like something out of science fiction, the F4U Corsair. When the first prototype took flight in 1940, it shattered expectations and records alike, becoming the first American single-engine fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. But it was far from perfect. Its long nose made it nearly impossible to land safely on a carrier, its landing gear buckled under stress, and its stall characteristics were vicious. The Navy called it unfit for deck operations, and the Corsair was quietly sidelined. But the Marines, fighting for survival in the jungles of the South Pacific, saw potential where others saw danger. They took the bent-wing bird, as they called it, and made it their own. On dusty airstrips carved from coral and jungle, they taught themselves how to tame it. They learned to land it in a wide, curving approach to compensate for its blind spots, to harness its monstrous power in the climb, and to dive with it into speeds no other aircraft could endure. Slowly, through trial and error, they unlocked the monster's soul. The Corsair's design was as unconventional as its legend would become. Its inverted gull wings, mocked by some as ungainly, allowed its massive propeller to clear the ground while keeping the landing gear short and strong. Inside, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine roared like a living thing, 18 cylinders generating more than 2,000 horsepower, turning the aircraft into a force of nature. The Corsair didn't outturn the Zero. It outran it, outclimbed it, and most importantly, outlived it. It was a survivor's weapon, made for men who'd grown tired of being prey. But in 1943, few outside the test squadrons understood what the Corsair could truly do. It was still new, unproven in real combat. Its arrival in the Solomon Islands was met with skepticism. Some Marines called it a flying coffin, others a mechanical miracle. The truth would soon reveal itself. The Solomon Islands campaign had already bled both sides dry. Guadalcanal, once a green paradise, had become a wasteland of rusting hulks and graves, marked only by the whisper of the wind through palm leaves. The Japanese still held strong positions across the chain, using airfields on Bougainville and New Georgia to launch daily raids. Every morning the sky filled with the wail of engines as American and Japanese squadrons clashed high above the islands, each fight a miniature war of its own. For the Japanese, air superiority was more than strategy. It was pride. The Zero was not just a weapon but a symbol of the Empire's spirit. Losing that edge meant losing face, and that could not be allowed. So when reports surfaced of a new American fighter with strange gull-shaped wings appearing over the Solomons, Japanese commanders dismissed it as propaganda or exaggeration. The Americans, they said, were desperate to frighten them. Another heavy clunker, one officer reportedly scoffed, "It will fall apart in the turn, but arrogance can be fatal in war." While the Japanese laughed, the Marines were preparing to unleash the Corsair's fury. Training missions became real sorties, and pilots began learning the new plane's deadly rhythm. Its quirks, its torque pull, its stall bite, were no longer flaws but weapons in the hands of men who understood them. The Marines discovered that if they stayed high, used the sun, and fought vertically rather than horizontally, The Zero's agility meant nothing. The Corsair could dive faster than gravity itself, strike like a hammer, and climb back into the heavens before the enemy could react. Every encounter added to their growing confidence. Every victory proved that the bent-winged bird could fly with the best of them. Still, the war was far from decided. Japan's reach was long and its spirit unbroken. The Imperial Navy continued to send squadrons to the Solomon Front, determined to crush the Americans before they could consolidate their foothold. It was in this pressure cooker of exhaustion, pride, and necessity that both sides would meet on July 5, 1943, a day that would forever alter their perception of each other. That morning, as the heat shimmered off the jungle canopy and the sea reflected the clouds like a mirror, neither the Japanese pilots climbing into their Zeros nor the Marines strapping themselves into their Corsairs could have known they were about to witness the birth of a legend. The Americans thought it would be another escort mission, a routine patrol above the island chains. The Japanese thought they were hunting the same sluggish, unrefined aircraft they had mocked since their first encounter. Neither realized that the age of the Zero, the myth of invincibility that had defined the Pacific Air War, was about to end. The Corsair was more than a fighter. It was a symbol of adaptation, of men and machines forged through failure. And as the sun rose over the endless Pacific, painting the clouds in crimson light, it was already waiting to claim its first victims. Standard, title. Standard, title, Section 3, Rising Tension and Foreshadowing. Single paragraph, 1,000+ words. Abraka, in the weeks leading up to July 5th, 1943, was alive with the tension of something building, something inevitable, as though both sides could feel that a shift was coming, but neither dared to name it. The Japanese patrols flew with growing unease, their missions stretching longer and deeper into enemy territory as American presence spread across the island chain. The Americans, meanwhile, were still testing their new machines, the F4U Corsairs, like uncertain predators learning the rhythm of their own power. Each dawn brought the same ritual, the groan of engines coming to life, the smell of oil and sea salt thick in the humid air, and the whispered thoughts of young pilots who knew that any sunrise could be their last. For the Marines stationed at Henderson Field, the war had become routine only in the sense that death was routine. They were fighting not for conquest, but for survival. Men pushed to the edge of exhaustion, finding meaning in every sortie that ended with wheels touching the ground. The Corsair was their last hope, the one weapon that might finally allow them to strike back hard enough to break Japan's grip on the skies. Yet even among its pilots, doubt lingered. The aircraft was fast, yes, terrifyingly so, but it was also unpredictable. Its landing quirks had already claimed lives, and its nickname among some crews, the Ensign Eliminator, was no joke. Still, those who survived their first few flights began to understand its personality, its hidden rhythm. They discovered that the Corsair was not a gentle machine. It demanded aggression, decisiveness, and courage bordering on recklessness. Pilots who hesitated were punished. Those who pushed it beyond reason found glory. That paradox defined the weeks before the coming battle, fear giving birth to confidence, confidence hardening into something close to faith. The Americans were learning not just to fly the Corsair, but to trust it. Each test mission over the islands brought them closer to perfection. They studied the behavior of the Zero, how it climbed, turned, and stalled. They learned to avoid the turning fight altogether, to use altitude as their weapon and the Corsair's raw speed as their shield. In mock dogfights, they practiced diving from the sun, attacking in brief, devastating bursts, then disappearing before the enemy could recover. Hit hard, get out, come back alive became their mantra. It was a new way of fighting, a science of aggression replacing the art of evasion. While they trained, the Japanese were growing restless. The once flawless precision of their aerial operations was fraying. New pilots lacked the polish of their predecessors. Fuel shortages limited their training. They still flew the Zero with skill and courage. But something was changing in the air. A growing realization that their legendary aircraft, the pride of Japan, was no longer unmatched. Reports filtered in from scattered encounters, strange blue fighters that could outdive them, that shrugged off damage which would have torn a Zero in half. Commanders dismissed these reports as exaggerations, but rumors spread like wildfire among the ranks. Bent wings, one mechanic said. Blue demons, another pilot whispered. The words meant nothing concrete, but they carried an undercurrent of fear. Even the veterans, men who had once laughed at the thought of American technology catching up, began to sense that something was different. The sky felt heavier now, more dangerous. There was talk of new American tactics, of planes that appeared suddenly from above, struck like lightning, and vanished into the clouds. The Japanese had long considered the Americans predictable, heavy, slow, and unimaginative. That perception was beginning to crack. Pride, however, is a stubborn thing. The Imperial Command refused to admit that their supremacy might be in danger. The Zero remains the emperor of the air, one officer declared at Rabaul. Whatever the Americans build, we will burn it. Orders went out to step up patrols to find and destroy any of the new aircraft spotted near the Solomons. It was meant as reassurance, but to those who would fly those missions, it felt like an invitation to fate. In late June, the Americans received intelligence that Japanese forces were regrouping near Bougainville, preparing for another attempt to strike Guadalcanal. Reconnaissance flights confirmed increased enemy activity, more aircraft, more supply barges. The Marines knew what that meant. There would be another major push, another test of whether their fragile hold on the Solomons could survive, and this time they intended to meet it head-on. Lieutenant Ken Walsh and his squadron of Corsair pilots were chosen to fly escort missions over the islands in early July. Their orders were simple but deadly: intercept any Japanese patrols that crossed into their airspace. No one expected anything extraordinary, but even as they prepared, there was a sense, a quiet certainty, that something was coming. You could feel it, Walsh would later say. The air itself felt electric. We were waiting for a storm that hadn't broken yet. The mechanics worked through the night, tuning engines, checking ammunition belts, and wiping grime from the curved blue wings that seemed to drink in the moonlight. The Corsairs, lined up on the strip like sleeping predators, gleamed faintly under the stars. Inside their cockpits, some pilots left small charms or letters taped to the dashboards, talismans against the unknown. Across the water, the Japanese were doing the same, fueling their Zeros, tightening bolts smoking quietly in the darkness. They, too, had no illusions about what awaited them. Every man who climbed into those planes knew that he might not return. Yet in their hearts they still believed in the legend of the Zero. It had carried them to victory before. Surely it would again. But legends fade and machines grow old. The balance of the war was shifting with every new engine built in an American factory, every pilot trained in the skies above California or Florida. The Japanese Empire, though still vast, was beginning to fracture under the weight of industrial reality. For the first time, they were fighting an enemy that could replace its losses faster than they could mourn them. Still, the idea of defeat was unthinkable. The pilots would fly and they would fight because that was all they knew. On the night of July 4th, storms rolled over the Solomons. Lightning flickered on the horizon, illuminating the clouds in flashes of white and violet. The Marines at Henderson Field huddled under tarps, listening to the thunder and pretending it didn't sound like the roar of engines. Somewhere beyond the storm, Japanese aircraft were already on the move, their silhouettes darting like shadows across the waves. Both sides were being drawn toward a moment neither could avoid. The Americans had a new weapon. The Japanese still had their pride. And the Pacific, endless and indifferent, waited to see which would survive the dawn. Standard Title 723. Variant Standard Title Section 4. The Trigger Event. Start of action, single paragraph, 1,000+ words. At first light, on July 5, 1943, the Pacific Ocean looked deceptively calm, a mirror of endless silver stretching beneath the rising sun, its surface betraying nothing of the violence about to unfold above it. And as the humidity clung to the air like a shroud, the American pilots of VMF 124 moved quickly across the muddy coral runway at Munda Point, their boots splashing through puddles as the mechanics pulled the wheel chocks away from the waiting F4U Corsairs, each aircraft a gleaming beast of bent wings and oil-streaked metal. Lieutenant Ken Walsh climbed into his cockpit, the smell of aviation fuel thick in his lungs. the vibration of the Pratt and Whitney R-2800 already pulsing through the ground. His crew chief slapped the fuselage twice, a silent blessing. "She'll bring you back, Lieutenant," the man shouted over the noise, though both of them knew that no such promise could ever be made. As Walsh throttled up, the propeller blurred into an invisible disk of fury, kicking up a storm of dust and debris. One by one, the Corsairs began to roll down the strip, engines howling as they clawed their way into the heavy morning air. The sound was unlike anything the Japanese on the nearby islands had ever heard, deep, guttural, and angry, like thunder rolling out of the clouds. To the men below, it sounded like a promise of vengeance. The mission was simple on paper: patrol the skies southwest of Rendova and engage any Japanese aircraft sighted approaching the transport lanes. But simple missions have a way of turning into legends. As the squadron climbed into formation, the tropical haze stretched around them, the sun just a pale coin behind the mist. Walsh adjusted his oxygen mask, checked his guns, and peered at the horizon. The radio crackled with routine chatter, the voices of men trying to sound calm even as the unknown awaited them beyond the next bank of clouds. The Corsairs leveled off at 10,000 feet, cruising in two tight 5 formations. Below them, the sea glittered faintly, and somewhere far to the north, Japanese Zeros were already airborne from their base at Kahili, 20 minutes away. Those pilots had been briefed before takeoff that the Americans were flying a new model of fighter, large, ungainly, and untested. Their orders were clear: engage and destroy. To them, this would be another exercise in superiority, another reminder that the Empire still ruled the air. At 0820 hours, the radar station at Munda detected incoming aircraft. The radio snapped alive. Bandits 20 miles out, heading south. The Corsair pilots tightened their formation. Walsh squinted into the haze, scanning for the faintest shimmer of metal against the brightening sky. Moments later, he saw them. Tiny specks, moving fast, diving from the north in perfect attack alignment. "Here they come," he said quietly, almost to himself. The Japanese formation split like an arrow, half climbing to gain altitude, half sweeping low to attack from below. It was a textbook tactic, one that had shredded countless American squadrons in the early years of the war. But today, the rules were about to change. "Break!" Walsh barked into his radio, and the sky exploded into motion. Corsairs twisted, rolled, and climbed as tracer fire cut through the air. The roar of engines merged with the rattle of machine guns, the crack of .50 caliber rounds echoing across the clouds. Walsh yanked his control stick back hard, pulling his plane into a steep climb. G-forces pressed him deep into his seat as his vision tunneled, the world reduced to the vibration of his cockpit and the howl of the engine. A Zero flashed past beneath him, graceful and silver. He kicked the rudder, rolled over, and dropped behind it, the gun sight glowing red on the target. He squeezed the trigger. The Corsair's 6 guns erupted, spitting molten light. The Zero burst apart in a fireball, its wings shearing off as it tumbled into the sea. Walsh barely had time to breathe before another enemy appeared behind him, tracers slicing past his canopy. He dove sharply, the Corsair's massive engine screaming as the airspeed needle climbed past 400. The Japanese pilot followed, but too late. He couldn't match the dive speed. The Zero began to shudder, then disintegrated as Walsh pulled up sharply, feeling the G-force crush his chest. He looked back in time to see the wreckage vanish into the waves below. Elsewhere, the battle raged in chaotic beauty. Blue Corsairs and silver Zeros tangled in the sunlight, twisting through the clouds like dueling dragons. The Japanese pilots tried to turn inside the Americans, but the Corsairs refused to play their game. They used vertical dives, slashing attacks, and raw power to dominate the engagement. Every time a Zero tried to follow, it stalled or snapped apart under the strain. The radio was alive with shouting, calls for help, confirmations of kills, static screams swallowed by the noise. "I got one, he's smoking. Check your 6, they're coming down from above." The sky became a kaleidoscope of tracers, smoke, and fire. Walsh spotted another pair of Zeros climbing toward one of his wingmen. He rolled inverted, dove straight down, and opened fire. One of the enemy planes disintegrated instantly. The other broke left, its pilot desperate to escape. Walsh pulled up through the debris, his cockpit trembling with the force. "That's 5, he muttered through gritted teeth, his voice barely audible over the roar. The engagement lasted only minutes, though it felt like a lifetime. The Corsair's power transformed the fight into a massacre. Their heavy guns ripped through the lightly armored Zeros, their speed making escape impossible. Below, sailors aboard American transports watched in awe as fragments of Japanese aircraft fell into the sea like burning confetti. For years, they had seen American planes shredded in similar battles. Today, it was different. Today, the hunters had become the hunted. In one surreal moment, Walsh glanced over his shoulder and saw two Corsairs diving in tandem through a cluster of Zeros, their wings flashing in the sunlight, guns blazing. The image would stay with him forever, blue thunder descending from heaven. Within 20 minutes, the sky was eerily quiet again. Smoke trails hung motionless in the air, slowly unraveling into the sea breeze. Where 12 Japanese aircraft had once been, there was nothing now but drifting ash and the faint echo of gunfire. Walsh leveled his Corsair, his hands trembling slightly on the controls. "All Corsairs, form up," came the call over the radio. The surviving Americans reassembled, battered but victorious. No one spoke for several seconds. They all knew what they had done. For the first time in the Pacific, the Zero had been decisively outmatched. The laughter, the arrogance, the myth, it had all vanished in the span of 20 minutes. Below them, the Solomon Sea glimmered like a sheet of glass, reflecting the smoke that still rose from the dying wrecks. The men in the Corsairs were silent, not out of pride, but disbelief. The monster they had feared, the machine so many had cursed on takeoff and prayed to on landing, had proven itself beyond all doubt. The F4U Corsair had arrived, and it had changed the war in a single morning. ACOFI ID 92215, Variant, Standard. Title, Section 5. The Shock. Revelation, single paragraph, 1,000+ words. The silence that followed the dogfight was almost unbearable, a kind of stillness that seemed to press down on the men's shoulders as they circled above the Solomon Sea, smoke curling from a few bullet holes and oil leaks, but all 12 Corsairs still airborne, their wings glinting faintly in the tropical sun like blades slick with blood. And yet below them there was nothing. No parachutes, no debris large enough to mark where the Japanese planes had been, just the faint shimmer of burning fuel drifting on the waves, vanishing into the blue. It took several minutes for the reality to sink in. 12 Zeros had entered the fight, and not one had survived. For the American pilots, hardened by months of losses and desperate air battles, it felt almost unreal, as if they had somehow broken the laws of war themselves. Ken Walsh checked his instruments, wiped the sweat from his face, and scanned the horizon again, half expecting more enemy aircraft to appear, to avenge their fallen comrades. But the sky remained empty, silent, like a stage after the final act. His voice came through the radio, quiet, almost reverent. "They're gone," he said, not as a boast, but as a confession. Down below, aboard the destroyer USS Waller, lookouts stared in disbelief through their binoculars. "They just disappeared," one sailor muttered, like someone turned them off. The officers watching knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The Corsair, once mocked as a misfit, had just rewritten the rules of air combat, and yet no one could fully explain how it had happened so quickly, so decisively. Japanese radio operators at Kahili Field kept calling out for the missing formation long after the battle, their voices rising in panic as minutes turned into hours with no reply. The pilots who had once laughed at the new American fighter were now names without graves, lost to the ocean they had once commanded. Back at Munda Point, when the Corsairs returned, the mechanics were waiting, eyes wide, trying to count how many planes came back. When all 12 roared over the treetops in tight formation, cheers erupted from the ground crews. They had expected losses, always losses, but not this. Walsh climbed out of his cockpit, his flight suit soaked through with sweat, his hands still shaking. He said nothing for a long while, just looked at the sky where a few distant contrails still lingered, fading into the sunlight. A reporter later asked him what it felt like to win so decisively, to annihilate a superior enemy force without losing a single man. Walsh only shrugged. "It wasn't luck," he said. "The Corsair did exactly what it was built to do. We just finally learned how to let it." In Tokyo, the news was received with confusion and disbelief. Japanese intelligence officers refused to believe the reports at first, convinced it must have been an error. tropical. Storms, fuel shortages, maybe a failed navigation return. But when no wreckage was found and no pilots returned, the truth became undeniable. The Imperial Navy's once invincible 6M0 had been humbled. Engineers scrambled to design upgrades, heavier armament, faster engines, but nothing could change the physics of it. The Zero had reached its limit, and the Corsair had just revealed it. For the Japanese pilots who survived later encounters with the new American fighter, stories began to spread through the barracks. Whispers of bent-winged devils that could dive faster than gravity, climb like demons, and tear a plane apart with a single burst of fire. Some refused to believe such stories until they saw the blue flash of a Corsair emerging from the clouds, guns blazing. The myth of American weakness in the air had ended here over the Solomon Islands on a morning when 12 planes vanished without trace. Walsh and his men were debriefed that afternoon, every detail of the fight analyzed by intelligence officers desperate to understand the secret of their success. Walsh's description was simple: speed, power, patience. The Corsair's massive engine and thick armor had made it nearly invincible in a dive, while its pilots had learned to fight vertically rather than turn in circles with the lighter Zeros. It was the difference between chasing and ambushing, between fighting the old war and defining the new one. Yet even in victory there was a somberness to the squadron's celebration. They knew that for every triumph like this, hundreds of other American crews were still dying elsewhere, on ships, in jungles, in aircraft that never returned. The Pacific War was far from over, but something fundamental had shifted. In a single battle, the balance of fear had changed sides. That night, as the men gathered near the mess tent, the conversation turned quiet. Some laughed nervously. Others replayed the fight in their heads over and over again. One mechanic, still wiping grease from his hands, asked Walsh softly, "Do you think they'll ever come back?" Walsh stared into the darkness beyond the campfires, the jungle whispering with unseen life. "They always come back," he said, "but they won't come the same way." A storm broke over the island that night, sheets of rain pounding against the metal wings of the Corsairs lined up under makeshift tarps. Thunder rolled out over the sea, echoing the sound of the morning's battle. In the barracks, a few of the younger pilots couldn't sleep, their ears still ringing with the roar of engines and gunfire. For them, this day would never fade. They had seen what the Corsair could do, what American engineering and desperation forged together could unleash, and they had seen how quickly arrogance in war can turn to fear. What would you have done in that moment, circling over an empty sea, realizing the enemy you had feared was gone without a trace, that the laughter that once filled the radio had turned to silence? Standard, 42,984. Variant, Standard Title, Section 6. The Collapse or Turning Tide, single paragraph 1,000 plus words, or in the following week. The balance in the skies over the Solomon Islands had shifted so completely that even the most confident Japanese pilots began to feel a quiet dread when they saw the blue silhouettes of the F4U Corsair glinting through the clouds, and what had once been certainty, their years of dominance, their unbroken rhythm of attack and victory, was suddenly replaced by something alien, hesitation, doubt, the unspoken knowledge that they were now being hunted. And as Japanese command scrambled to understand how the Americans had achieved such devastating success, their air groups grew thinner, their replacements less experienced, their tactics stretched to the breaking point, while across the Pacific, American engineers worked day and night to refine the Corsair even further, sanding away every flaw the early versions had shown, tuning it into a weapon that no longer merely fought for survival, but dictated the terms of combat itself. Pilots who had once joked that the Corsair was cursed now called it blessed, the Whistling Death, a nickname born from the eerie sound of air rushing through its wing-mounted intakes during dives, a sound that sent shivers down the spines of anyone unlucky enough to hear it closing in behind them. In August, when the Japanese attempted another raid near New Georgia, they sent 30 aircraft, Zeros, Vals, and Kates, escorted by their most decorated ace, Commander Toshio Ota. He had more than 50 kills to his name and absolute faith in the Zero's agility. What he didn't know was that American radar had picked up the formation long before they arrived, and a squadron of Corsairs had already risen to meet them, engines roaring like a coming storm. When the two forces collided, the difference was immediate and brutal. The Zeros tried to turn as they always had, curling inward like dancers, but the Corsairs refused the invitation. They stayed high, then dove in fast, firing short, surgical bursts that tore through the enemy formations. Oda himself tried to climb out of danger, pulling his stick hard, but the Corsair behind him followed effortlessly, its engine screaming as it closed the gap. Witnesses later said the blue fighter came down like a hammer from the sky, guns flashing for less than a second before the commander's aircraft burst into flame and spiraled toward the sea. The loss shattered what little confidence remained in the Japanese squadrons. After that battle, reports from Kahili and Rabaul were filled with phrases rarely seen before: enemy superiority, unexpected acceleration, inability to engage. The men who returned spoke of Corsairs appearing out of nowhere, diving faster than any aircraft should survive, then climbing vertically as if pulled by invisible wires. Some claimed the American planes could absorb dozens of bullets and keep flying. Others said their pilots never broke formation, never panicked, moving with machine-like precision. The myth of invincibility that had protected Japan's Air Corps for so long evaporated in the tropical heat. By late summer, replacement pilots arriving from the mainland were young, barely trained, and terrified. They whispered stories in their tents about comrades who vanished in seconds, about engines that failed to climb fast enough, about the deep, terrible whistle that meant it was already too late. On the American side, the change was just as profound. The Corsair pilots who had once prayed before every takeoff now strapped in with quiet confidence. They knew their plane could outdive, outrun, and outshoot anything Japan had left. When Ken Walsh received orders for another patrol, he no longer thought of the odds. He thought of precision, altitude, timing. Each sortie felt less like a gamble and more like a test of control, of how perfectly they could execute what the Corsair had been born to do. In one fight that September, over the waters north of Kolombangara, Walsh's flight intercepted a formation of 15 enemy aircraft. It lasted less than 6 minutes. 11 were destroyed. The rest fled. As the last Zero broke off and disappeared into the clouds, one of the younger American pilots radioed, almost disbelieving, "That's it? They're gone?" There was no cheer, no celebration, just static and the hum of engines. The war in the air had changed, but the men knew the price of every victory. Downed Japanese aircraft meant downed pilots, many of them once proud, disciplined men fighting for what they believed was an unshakable empire. In the aftermath, American intelligence began intercepting Japanese transmissions that hinted at a growing desperation. Requests for new aircraft went unanswered. Fuel shortages crippled training. Some squadrons were ordered to conserve ammunition, to avoid engagements unless absolutely necessary. The Corsair had not just beaten the Zero, it had broken the spirit of those who flew it. On the decks of U.S. carriers and at forward island bases, the maintenance crews could feel it too. They watched the enemy raids grow smaller and less coordinated, saw fewer dogfights erupt in the skies above. The silence that replaced them was strange, almost melancholy. The war was still raging across the Pacific, but here in these island skies the tide had turned irreversibly. When Walsh and his men landed after each mission, the cheers were quieter now, replaced by something heavier, a kind of respect for the men they had defeated and the machine that had made it possible. One evening, as the sun sank behind the palms and the sound of crickets filled the air, Walsh stood beside his Corsair, running his hand along the cool metal of its fuselage. "It's not just the plane," he said to another pilot beside him. "It's what it makes you believe you can do." The other man nodded but said nothing. Both of them knew the truth. Belief could win battles, but it also demanded a toll. Can you imagine witnessing that? Watching the sky itself change, the hunters becoming the hunted, the old masters of the air reduced to shadows chased by blue-winged thunder? The Pacific had never felt so vast or so small as it did then, when one aircraft, forged in desperation and perfected through loss, had tilted the scales of an entire war with the sound of its screaming wings. Hokuhaidi, Standard Titles 20, Variant, Standard Title, Section 7, Aftermath and Consequences. Single paragraph, 1,000 plus words. Ebury, when the smoke cleared over the Solomon Islands and the last echoes of aerial combat faded into the horizon, What remained was not triumph, but transformation, because the events of July 1943 had done more than destroy a formation of enemy aircraft. They had dismantled an illusion, one that had shaped the Pacific War since its earliest days. And as American intelligence officers compiled their reports, the numbers told a story that was almost unbelievable. 12 Japanese planes gone in 20 minutes, not a single Corsair lost, a perfect victory achieved by an aircraft that many in the U.S. Navy had once dismissed as too dangerous for carrier operations, too unstable for combat, and yet here it was, rewriting doctrine, reshaping confidence, and proving that the Allied air forces could no longer be considered inferior to the Empire of Japan. The impact rippled outward like shockwaves across the Pacific. Commanders at Rabaul began pulling their best pilots back for defense rather than offense, fearing that every sortie could turn into another massacre, while in Washington, engineers and strategists saw the Corsair as the answer to a problem that had haunted them since Pearl Harbor: control of the skies. Production lines accelerated overnight. Factories in Connecticut and Ohio ran without pause, forging the sleek, bent wings that would soon cover the decks of every major carrier. But it wasn't just about machinery, it was about morale, and in that respect the effect was almost immeasurable. American pilots who had once entered the air shaking with fear now flew with a quiet, steely determination. They spoke of the Corsair not as a machine, but as a companion, a living thing that demanded respect and offered salvation. On the Japanese side, the psychological collapse was palpable. Intelligence intercepts captured fragments of despair from pilots who described the Corsair as an enemy that seemed to defy physics, capable of vanishing into clouds only to reappear in the sun's glare, its heavy guns ripping through metal and flesh with terrifying precision. The word invincible began to shift sides. By autumn of 1943, the Imperial Navy's command structure had changed its tone entirely. Missions once planned with aggressive confidence now began with hesitation, maps covered in red ink showing zones where Corsairs had been reported, areas to avoid at all costs. Even the most veteran pilots began to feel the pressure of attrition. The losses over the Solomons had drained their confidence. Their younger replacements lacked the skill to keep pace. And for every Japanese ace who fell, it took years to train another who could match his instincts. The Americans, by contrast, had found a rhythm. Fast, brutal, effective. The Corsair squadrons were becoming legends in their own time, their kill ratios soaring, their tactics refined to surgical precision. The skies that had once belonged to the Zero were now blue with the bent wings of their successors. Yet, amidst the triumph, there was a haunting awareness that each victory carried a human cost. Wreckage still floated across the sea, oil slicks marking the resting places of men who had believed utterly in their cause. Some Corsair pilots reported seeing flashes of color beneath the waves, fabric perhaps from a life jacket or a uniform, and feeling no joy at the sight. It wasn't hate that drove them anymore, but inevitability. The war machine had taken on its own momentum, one fueled by necessity and loss. At Munda Point, Walsh sat for an interview with a war correspondent weeks after the battle. The man asked what had changed. "Everything," Walsh replied. "Before, we were fighting not to die. Now we're fighting to finish." His words would appear in newspapers across the United States, alongside photographs of smiling pilots and the iconic curve of the Corsair's wings. The image inspired thousands of young men to enlist, to take to the skies in those same blue machines that now symbolized retribution and hope. But behind the propaganda, the truth was more complicated. Each success brought new challenges, longer missions, harsher conditions, enemies who grew more desperate as defeat loomed closer. By early 1944, the Japanese Air Command had shifted its strategy, focusing on night operations and suicide tactics that could exploit the few weaknesses remaining in Allied air superiority. The Corsair had changed the game, but it had not ended it. It had only forced it into darker territory. In Tokyo, engineers raced to design faster interceptors, but they were working against time and dwindling resources. The Empire's once proud industry was faltering under constant bombardment, and every new prototype remained on paper long after it was needed in the sky. The Corsair's arrival had done more than tilt the tactical balance. It had accelerated the unraveling of Japan's strategic illusion of invincibility. It showed that no matter how skilled a pilot was, no matter how refined a plane's maneuverability, raw power, durability, and adaptability could rewrite the laws of engagement. And so, in the months that followed, every new encounter between American and Japanese forces became a grim echo of that July morning, a repetition of the same pattern: Zeros diving, Corsairs climbing, and the sea swallowing the results. For the men who survived both sides of the conflict, the battle became a symbol, not just of victory or loss, but of evolution, the moment when the old ways of air warfare finally yielded to the industrial might and relentless innovation of modern combat. On quiet nights, far from the roar of engines, some of the veterans would admit that the sound of a Corsair diving, the distinct whistle that earned it its fearsome nickname, never truly left their ears. Even in peace, it haunted them, a reminder of the day when the sky itself seemed to turn against those who had once ruled it. The aftermath of that July battle was not just written in reports and statistics. It was written in memory, in the way pilots looked at the horizon, in the tremor of their hands when they recalled the way 12 planes had simply vanished into nothing. It was the end of an era, the death of the myth of the Zero, and the birth of a legend that would define the rest of the Pacific War. Standard title, section and closing, standard title, section 8, legacy, reflection, and closing, single paragraph, 1,000 plus words, Hyber, long after the guns fell silent, and the Pacific turned from battlefield to graveyard. The legend of the F4U Corsair continued to echo through the memories of the men who flew it, the men who fought against it, and the generations who would later study the war and wonder how a single machine could so completely change the rhythm of combat. Because July 5, 1943 was not just another date in the long and brutal ledger of the Second World War. It was the moment the myth of the Zero crumbled and the era of American air dominance truly began, and as veterans retold the story decades later, they could still feel the vibration of those engines in their bones, the smell of burned oil and cordite clinging to their memories, the sound of the radio crackling with static as their world shifted from fear to control. The Corsair became more than a fighter. It became a symbol of what desperation could build when defeat was no longer an option, a fusion of power and persistence born from lessons written in blood, and its curved wings, once mocked as awkward, became the most feared silhouette in the Pacific sky. The Japanese pilots who survived the war, men who had once laughed at the sight of the bent-wing bird, spoke later with awe and respect, calling it the most formidable foe they had ever faced, admitting that when the Corsair arrived, they knew the tide had turned for good. One former Zero ace told an interviewer years after the war, "When I first saw it, I thought it was ugly. When I fought it, I thought it was unstoppable." The irony was painful but undeniable. Japan had built its empire on the agility and elegance of the Zero, but in the end, it was power, brute, unrelenting power, that defined survival. As the years passed, the Corsair continued to fly, serving in Korea and beyond, outliving even some of the men who had doubted it, its design so ahead of its time that it seemed to bridge two worlds, the era of propellers and the dawn of jets. In museums today, it rests in silence, its blue paint faded, but its presence still commanding, the same graceful menace that once filled the skies above the Solomons. Visitors stand beneath its wings and stare upward, trying to imagine what it must have felt like to sit in that cockpit, to face death in every direction and somehow find the will to climb higher still. They read the plaques, they see the names, Walsh, Blackburn, Kepford, and they hear the stories of men who turned the impossible into history. But even those words cannot capture the truth of that morning in 1943, when laughter on the Japanese radios turned to static and the Pacific winds carried away the last echoes of disbelief. The Corsair was not perfect. It was flawed, temperamental, dangerous to land, but in those flaws lay its humanity, the same stubbornness that mirrored the men who built it, the men who refused to give up even when the war seemed unwinnable. It taught the world that innovation is not born from comfort, but from necessity, that sometimes the ugly, unorthodox solution is the one that saves you. Historians would later call it the embodiment of American engineering spirit, but for the men who flew it, it was something simpler, a partner, a protector, and sometimes a ghost. Ken Walsh survived the war with 21 confirmed kills, earning the Medal of Honor, yet when asked about his most vivid memory, he didn't speak of medals or victories. He spoke of that first battle, when the sky turned blue with vengeance, and 12 enemy planes vanished as if swallowed by the sea. "We didn't think about glory," he said quietly in an interview years later. "We just thought about getting home, but when we landed and saw every man return, I knew something had changed. We weren't fighting from behind anymore. We were fighting forward." The Corsair had done more than win battles. It had restored belief. It showed that technology and courage, when joined, could rewrite destiny itself. And yet, as the war dragged on and the islands burned, even the Corsair could not shield its pilots from the weight of what victory required. For every triumphant return, there were others who never came back, men whose last view of the world was a sky filled with flame and cloud. The Corsair's legacy, therefore, is not one of glory alone, but of sacrifice and evolution. The understanding that superiority in war comes not only from machines, but from the will to learn faster, adapt harder, and never underestimate the enemy again. Today, when that same aircraft appears at air shows, its engine roaring across peaceful skies, old veterans still look up with a mix of pride and melancholy. They hear the whistle of the wings and are carried back to that July morning, to the smell of rain and the sight of the sea flashing below, to the moment when laughter turned to silence and history tilted on its axis. And perhaps, somewhere deep down, they remember the unspoken truth that every pilot who lived through it understood, that the greatest victories are not about dominance, but survival, not about perfection, but persistence, not about how many enemies fall, but how many men come home. The Corsair stands as proof of that, an imperfect savior forged in desperation, feared by its enemies, loved by its pilots, and remembered by all who saw what it could do. It remains, even now, a symbol of the day the Pacific changed color, from the silver of the Zero to the blue of the Corsair, from the sound of laughter to the sound of thunder. Do you think history could have gone differently?